Hello. Today I am going to review a documentary called Inequality for All, which speaks about the problems of growing wealth inequality all around the world. And it attempts to explain the reasons behind growing global wealth inequality. But I think it does a horrible job, so that's why I'm making this video. So in part one of my Growing Global Wealth Inequality series, I basically just outlined the facts of growing global wealth inequality, or growing wealth inequality in the United States of America. However, this is a problem all over the world. So it's just not that global wealth inequality is growing in America, but it is growing in Africa, it is growing in Asia, it is growing in Europe. So a logical person would conclude that there are common denominators behind the reason why global wealth inequality is increasing and a serious problem that we all must address. So I thought a good way to do this would be to look at Robert Reich's documentary called Inequality for All and analyze whether the reasons he gives are correct or incorrect. So he provides a lot of reasons that on the surface sound very credible and actually appear to be very connected. But as we all know, there's a huge difference between correlation and causation. So I think that Robert Reich speaks a lot about correlation in this documentary and fails to address reasons of causation. And the primary causation of growing global wealth inequality is basically central bankers, the central banking platform, and fractional reserve banking. But Robert Reich fails to address this a single time in his entire documentary. So this is what we're going to take a look at. Now, this video today is going to be quite long. It's almost an hour long. But I do hope that you stay for the entire video and watch it, because I think for example, if you're a student in Reich's Wealth and Poverty class at UC Berkeley, or his previous classes at Harvard, or if you're studying at the London School of Economics, Oxford, Princeton, or any of these so-called top-tier schools, you are not going to receive the truth about what is really going on in the banking system today, what is the causation of growing global wealth inequality. And I guarantee that you will learn a lot more in this 1 hour than you would in an entire semester in any finance class, in any economics class, in any class about wealth and poverty, at any of these elite institutions, because they're just going to teach you what they want you to believe, and they're not going to teach you the truth. So I'm going to, through the process of this video, show you a number of clips from Robert Reich's documentary. So let's start with the first one now.
I've seen single mothers work 3 jobs just to be able to pay rent. And I didn't want that. So I started going to school. How do you build wealth? Not that I want to be wealthy, how do you do it? How the heck do you build wealth? Like, when you don't have anything, when you don't have any assets, when you don't have nothing.
Now, as this woman asks, how do you build wealth if you don't have any? Well, you're certainly not going to learn by watching this documentary called Inequality for All, because in this documentary, Robert Reich attributes the reasons for massive growing wealth inequality in America to every single factor except the true factors, which are central bankers and fractional reserve banking. So I'm going to explain to you in this video why it is literally impossible for those dwelling in poverty to get out of poverty without any outside assistance. Now, if we were operating under a true monetary system that uses real money, it would be possible for those dwelling in poverty to gradually move out of poverty into the middle class. But I am going to explain in this video again why it is literally impossible under this immoral, fraudulent currency system we have today for those living in poverty to move out of poverty. And who is Robert Reich? Well, Robert Reich was the Secretary of Labor under former U.S. President Bill Clinton from 1993 to 1997. And then he went on to teach at Harvard University, and he teaches now a class called Wealth and Poverty at University of California, Berkeley. Now, why I feel compelled to make this video to debunk his documentary called Inequality for All is because I feel that he spews so much disinformation in that documentary that one, because it's disinformation that he spews, and I'll show you through various clips again that I'm going to play from that documentary in this video, that it appears on the surface, the reasons he provides, to be eligible and valid reasons, but once I analyze it and deconstruct his analysis, then you can see that these are totally false reasons that are given. Now, I don't believe Reich to be malicious in any manner. I think he's just a byproduct of the Western education system, the institutional academic system that is controlled by these pro-U.S. dollar banking cartel, and these pro-U.S. dollar bankers, so who don't teach you anything proper about money, for example. So one of the most important qualities of all money has to be the maintenance and preservation of purchasing power over long periods of time. I'm not even talking about decades, over centuries. And no fiat currency in the world does this today. So if you ask 100 people that graduate from any of these schools, like Princeton, the London School of Economics, Harvard, Oxford, what should the qualities of real money be? I guarantee you it would be very hard to find 1 out of 100, probably 1 out of 1,000 that would give you proper answers to that question. So when you have these pro-U.S. dollar banking cartels like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank for central banks, and you have other divisions like the Exchange Stabilization Fund within the central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve, all conspiring to enslave people through debt enslavement, through fake immoral currencies, then I feel that, especially in this documentary, since it espouses everything contributing to global wealth inequality except the real reasons, I feel responsibility to make a video so people can really understand what the true reasons are. So it is encouraging to see that half the world now realizes the concepts I'm going to explain to you in this video, and that would be the BRICS nations, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There's other nations that are also going to join this BRICS alliance, like Germany and perhaps even Japan and some of the other Asian nations, I think, and the Pacific Rim nations will join this alliance too, because they don't want to see their citizens destroyed. Now, the reason that these BRICS nations have announced their own BRICS Development Bank, and they also announced recently their own BRICS Food Bank, is because they don't want their citizens to be ruined by the Western banking cartels that are insistent on trying to preserve U.S. dollar hegemony. And by U.S. dollar, I mean these fake fiat currencies that destroy people's wealth over time. They don't want to subject their citizens to this, so they're moving away totally from the U.S. dollar. And this movement away from the U.S. dollar is why we're seeing such political havoc all around the world now as well, because these pro-U.S. dollar bankers and these banking cartels want to go to war against the BRICS nations for breaking away from the U.S. dollar, which sounds insane because they are furious, say, like at Russia and China, for announcing natural gas deals in which they cut out the dollar and they're just going to transact business in their own currencies. Now, when you think about that, who has a right to tell other countries how and what form of currencies they could use to conduct international trade? It sounds insane, but it doesn't sound insane if you never think about it, because the mass media is also on board with these pro-U.S. dollar banking cartels. So let's move on to clip number 2 from this documentary.
They didn't go to work because there were all these wonderful professional opportunities open to women. Some of them did, but that's not the major reason women went to work. They went to work mainly because they had to prop up family incomes that were dropping because the men in the family, their wages were going nowhere. But there's only a limit to how many young mothers can go into work. And so the second strategy used by the 1990s was that families, both men and women, work longer hours.
So in that video clip I just showed you, he said the reason women had to enter the workforce was because men's incomes were stagnating. Therefore, families needed the extra income, and that is the sole reason that women had to enter the workforce. No, 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 no. That is not the reason why women had to enter the workforce, because men's stagnating incomes would have been even okay if central bankers and commercial bankers were not destroying the purchasing power of the US dollar. The real reason women had to enter the workforce was because central bankers and commercial bankers, through fractional reserve banking, were destroying the purchasing power of the US dollar. Therefore, families need to spend more money to buy the exact same goods and services that they needed to survive on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And that's the reason. So remember, in a previous video, I told you that the most dangerous lies of all are those lies that are mixed in with truth. Because you hear something that you know to be truthful, and then you hear that's followed by a lie, then you're more apt to believe that lie as well. So this is kind of what Robert Reich is doing in this documentary. He's mixing a lot of almost truths, like half-truths, with a lot of lies, and that's why everything sounds so good on the surface. But don't be fooled by this tactic. Now, no matter where you live in the world, whether it was Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo, Nairobi, Amsterdam, Berlin, Barcelona, San Francisco, New York, LA, if you grew up at a time when you remember that your mom was a homemaker and stayed at home, and that your dad's income was sufficient, but you didn't grow up in an extremely wealthy neighborhood, the reason why now you rarely see a man being the breadwinner earning an income unless he's a millionaire or multimillionaire is the same all over the world. It's because central banks destroyed your currency, whether it was the British pound, whether it's the American dollar, whether it was the Japanese yen, whether it's the euro. So that is the same reason all around the world. Now I'm going to show this to you, demonstrating in US dollars. I'm going to show you a graph that shows how much the purchasing power of $50,000 has been destroyed in just 35 years. So I'm going to show you a period from 1980 to April of 2014. So that's just 35 years. Now, I'm going to show you the destruction of purchasing power, how central bankers and commercial bankers have destroyed the purchasing power of the US dollar, and I said all fiat currencies all around the world as well, through fractional reserve banking by using, now again, this is official government inflation statistic, but just the one they used in 1980, because through the years, they've changed the inflation formula many, many times to actually strip out factors of inflation, to lie to the people. So if you use official government inflation formula from 1980, then you use official, the real inflation rates of 8, 9, 10, 11%, and even higher, 13% in the 1980s, that we have experienced versus the bogus official inflation rates the U.S. government gives us today of like 2%, then you will find the purchasing power of $50,000 has been reduced to $3,277. Now think about that. Let that statement sink in again. The purchasing power of $50,000 in 1980, just in 35 years to April 2014, has been reduced to $3,277. So let me show you on this graph. Okay, I just want to explain what I just showed to you in that chart. Now I took true inflation rates from 1980 to 2014. And by true inflation rates, I meant I basically took the shadow stats, annualized inflation rates, and then figured out how much the dollar has devalued in terms of 1980 dollars. All bankers have systematically stripped out factors of inflation from the formula for the past couple decades to produce the lies they produce today. Because today they're saying in the US inflation is about 2%, and in many countries in Europe even lower than that. So if you believe that, you're a fool, because you can easily check this by just getting a basket of goods that you use on a weekly basis at one point, and then 12 months later, checking the exact same price for
for that exact same basket of goods, you have to make sure it's for the exact same quantities as well, like volume, because there's a lot of shrinkage in food. Well, they will keep the price same, but shrink the package and give you less of it. So you got to compare apples to apples and make sure you can see it's much higher than 2% or 1.5% or whatever they're telling you in your country for the inflation rate.
Now, although that stat may sound astounding to you and really difficult to believe that $50,000 in just 1980 could have now been reduced to $3,277 today, as far as the purchasing power is concerned. The only reason this may seem or sound astounding to you is because of the fake inflation statistics that governments are selling you all around the world. So it doesn't matter what country you are. Every country I've looked at the inflation statistics, they have been fake. So governments and bankers have worked together to strip out true factors of inflation to tell you a false inflation statistic. Now, listen to how Robert Reich explains the growing wealth inequality in this clip.
The typical male worker in 1978 was making around $48,000 adjusted for inflation, while the average person in the top 1% earned $390,000. Now fast forward. By 2010, the typical male worker earned even less than he did then, but the person at the top got more than twice as much as before. Today, the richest 400 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 150 million of us put together. Now think about it. 400 people have more wealth than half the population of the United States. Some people say to me, but wait a minute. You've got technologies today that you didn't have in 1980. We didn't have flat screen televisions. We didn't have low-cost air travel. We didn't have Skype. We didn't have the internet. So who are the winners and losers from this great shift? Consumers certainly are winning. I mean, you guys, as consumers, you are doing very well. You get wonderful products. Almost everything you're buying is getting cheaper, and the investors are doing well. Here is a chart showing the rise and fall of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. You can see something here. There is sort of a pattern. Woo! You see, something happened, and I think it happened starting right in these years. You see, these were the years I was Labor Secretary. And
now, what Robert Reich says here, it sounds good. Again, it sounds great, actually, on the surface. And it sounds very reasonable. You get better products over time for a cheaper price. And so consumers are winning, right? Wrong. Consumers are losing, because there's no way consumers can be winning when their currency is being debased. So Lenin, the former USSR, said the fastest way to destroy a nation's wealth or the wealth of its citizens is to debase the currency. And that is definitely what every central banker and commercial banker in the world is doing to their citizens today. So how can consumers be winning? What Reich is addressing is basically Moore's law, right? So I believe it was Gordon, I can't remember his first name, Gordon Moore of Intel. He said something like, the power of your computer will double every 2 years and you'll be able to get it for the same price. But that is just the advancement of technology. That is an entirely separate issue from the debasement of currency. And Robert Reich is basically linking two totally unrelated concepts to sell you on the idea that consumers are winning over time, and there's nothing wrong going on with currency. And that is ludicrous, because as technology develops over time, of course, the inputs to make that product are going to decrease over time, because some of the work that was done by humans is now done by machinery. So you should be getting a better product over time for a cheaper price. And it would be even cheaper if we were using real money today, say like we had a 100% gold-backed system, then we would be getting products for even a cheaper price than we are today, because there wouldn't be any inflation over time. And at the end of that clip, notice the chart that Robert Reich shows you where he says, oh, and the stock markets are doing great. And by implication, he's trying to say the economy is fine. That's not why there's growing wealth inequality all over the world, because he said, look, here's the time I took over as Secretary of Labor sometime in 1990, and then there's almost an exponential rise in the U.S. stock markets in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And this is the same bunch of rubbish that all financial advisors and all wealth managers working for commercial banks always tell you. They show you these charts and say, look, if you just invest over time, you're always going to make money. But what Robert Reich fails to explain, I'm going to show you in the next chart that I made, that when stock markets rise on the back of devaluing currencies, you could have, it could look like a great increase in wealth, but you could actually be gaining zero real wealth over time. And in fact, that's just what happened, because as of 1990, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 2,748.72. As of April 2014, okay, so just 25 years later, it was 16,580. So that sounds like an enormous increase in wealth. But remember, this increase is coming on the back of devalued dollars, because over that same time, using real inflation rates, again, which I've drawn from shadowstats.com, which uses the 1980 U.S. government inflation formula, you will discover that since 1990, when Robert Reich says the economy is doing great, everyone's making money, so what is going on? Why is there growing global wealth inequality? You will find that the U.S. dollar devalued by over 88% just in those 25 years. So what has happened, which would mean just to break even, the Dow would have to increase by 8.5 times. So even if it goes up 8.5 times, you're just breaking even. What is 8.5 times with that starting point in January 1990? It's over 23,373. What did I tell you the Dow was at? I told you the Dow was at 16,580. So you are losing money in real wealth terms. And let me explain in a visual form. Okay, so basically, let me just briefly explain what I just showed you. So the green portion of that graph that you saw rising in an exponential fashion was the devaluation of the U.S. dollar, so the exponential devaluation of the U.S. dollar by central bankers and their crony commercial bankers as well over time. And you see that coincided perfectly with the exponential rise of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So did you actually gain any real wealth over that time? As I just proved to you from 1990 to 2014, no, you actually lost real wealth. So the lesson to take away here is the fact that just because you have an increased amount of currency does not mean that you have become wealthier. It is not important how much currency you have, but it is only important what that currency can buy. Let me say that again. It is not important how much currency you have, but it is only important what that currency can buy. So in other words, you can have twice as much currency, twice as much US dollars, twice as many euros, twice as many Japanese yen, twice as many pound sterling. But if half the amount of that currency 25 years ago could buy you more goods and services, then you are actually poorer with twice the nominal amount of currency. Now, if all currencies were real money, if we're talking real money, then yes, if you had twice the amount of real money, you'd be able to purchase twice the amount of goods and services, and your real wealth would actually increase. But that's the big scam of central bankers and fractional reserve banking, is that they want to sell you on the belief that the more you have of the currency, the wealthier you are. And obviously, if you know anything about the history of currencies and money over time, you know that this is not true. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to price the Dow, again, over that period of the last 25 years when the Dow's really taken off. It looks like in an exponential manner, but of course priced in the failing fiat currency of the US dollar. I'm going to price the Dow in gold, and I'm going to show you a chart. And you will see in that chart during this period when Robert Reich says the economy is doing tremendously well and consumers are winning, that the Dow, when priced in gold, has actually fallen more than 70%. Has fallen more than 70%. I want to repeat that twice so that sinks in. So you understand that a rise in the number of fiat currency and the nominal amount of fiat currency you own actually translated into a real loss of real wealth. So again, don't be conned by Robert Reich's documentary Inequality for All when none of the reasons he's giving you for the growing global wealth inequality, whether you live in Asia, whether you live in the Americas, whether you live in the EU or Africa, are not true. Now remember that this 70% loss of the Dow when priced in gold over the past 25 years actually even includes the last 2 years when central bankers have been desperate to suppress the price of gold and have knocked the price of gold down in just their fake, bogus, paper derivative markets like futures, like the futures markets in London and New York, and I've gone into great deal in other videos how they do this, so I'm not going to go into that now. So even when you look at the suppressed price of gold over the last 2 years, the Dow has still lost 70% against the price when valued against the price of gold. That is incredible to me. Now, of course, you're going to get a lot of banking shills on these types of videos that say, oh, look, the gold bull is over, it's done. But these are just people that don't understand what money is and would rather put their money in risky fiat currencies.
In the 3 decades after World War II, a period that I call the Great Prosperity, the economy boomed. But not only did the economy boom, but you had very low inequality. We made education a national priority, particularly higher education. By 1940, only 5% of adult Americans had a 4-year college degree, but that percentage began to explode. The GI Bill paid college costs for those who returned from war, and the subsequent expansion of public universities made higher education affordable to many.
So again, in that clip I just showed you, Robert Reich says you have to connect the dots between growing education in America and growing income. And then he said, then something happened in the 1970s, and before you had rising incomes all the way up to the 1970s, and then something happened. Income started stagnating and leveling off. But the problem is Robert Reich never connects the most important dots, because what happened in the 1970s was that President Nixon, at the behest of the bankers, went off the gold standard. And even back then, it wasn't, Bretton Woods was not a true gold standard. Okay? It was a pseudo gold standard. It was a fake gold standard. But even a fake gold standard was better than what we're on today, this fractional reserve banking system and fiat currency system we're on today. So that kind of helped price stability for a little bit, but of course didn't work in such a way that a true gold standard would have worked. But you see what he's telling you. He's talking about stagnating wages. He's talking about the decrease of wages that occurs, but he never talks about the purchasing power of wages. How can you not talk about that? Because that's the most important point. So if you're making $20 an hour, say today you're making $10 an hour a decade ago, but the $20 an hour today has less purchasing power than $10 a decade ago would have, which it does, then you're a poor making twice as much a nominal wage as you were 10 years ago. And that is the most important point that Robert Reich doesn't address a single time. So remember, like that chart he showed you of the booming U.S. economy because the stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was booming. Well, look at Zimbabwe in 2007 when it had hyperinflation. Of course, the U.S. dollar hasn't hit hyperinflation yet, but it is a distinct and real possibility that a lot of people just think is so unfathomable, so unrealistic. But if you really understand the currency wars that are going on between central banks, it is a real possibility today that hyperinflation could happen to the US dollar at some point within, say, the next 5 years or 8 years or so. But back to my point about the Zimbabwe stock market. Now, the Zimbabwe, because the Zimbabwe dollar suffered inflation, there are people that put $100,000 or even $10,000 into the Zimbabwe Industrial Index, and it went to $1 billion. But they had $1 billion Zimbabwe dollars that basically could buy them one dinner because of hyperinflation. So they're much better off and have much more purchasing power when they had that 10,000 Zimbabwe dollars or that 100,000 Zimbabwe dollars versus $1 billion Zimbabwe dollars. And that is a point, the crucial point about the immorality of fractional reserve banking, the immorality of fiat currencies that Robert Reich never once addresses in his entire documentary. Okay, so just to make sure no one gets my message twisted, I'm not saying education is bad. Education is great, but it's the proper type of education, because almost every institution, academic institution in the world today teaches Keynesian economics, which will teach you falsehoods and lies about the banking system, about central banking, about what money is, about fractional reserve banking, about currency. So you go on, you get your MBA, you get your PhD in economics, you're actually going to hurt your ability to build wealth if you go to such institutions that teaches you such lies. So one video I recommend that you watch as a supplement to this video is What Kind of Thinker Are You? Because there have been lots of studies about institutional academia that prove that children enter the academic system as divergent thinkers, but they exit as convergent thinkers. So their ability to think critically has been destroyed by the institutional academic process. So it's important to surround yourself with not people that agree with everything you say, but people that challenge you to basically explain your beliefs and ensure that you're able to logically explain your beliefs. Because a lot of things which may sound incredulous to you in this video are things that, if you think about it from a logical perspective, are absolutely 100% logical. So as I said, Robert Reich explains, he makes a leap between correlation and causation, saying that there was an increase in the number of people going to school in America, and there's an increase in wealth. There's a decrease in labor unions, and then there's a decrease in income and growth in income inequality and wealth inequality in America. But I'm going to show you that there's a huge, huge difference between correlation and causation. So you could be talking about there can still be some minimal correlation. So these could be like outlying factors that contribute to growing global wealth inequality, but not the primary factors. And then you can make the mistake, which I think Reich does time and time again in the documentary Inequality for All, in attributing these tiny, minute factors and contributors to growing global wealth inequality and calling them the primary factors of growing global wealth inequality, which is very dangerous, because if people don't understand why wealth inequality is growing at such a rapid pace, then they won't know how to solve the problem. Not only will they not know how to solve it, but they won't know how to protect and preserve the wealth that they currently have. Okay, so I'm going to show you a graph right now that actually shows extremely high correlation and explain why correlation does not mean causation, and how people spread disinformation by binding correlation with causation. So here's the graph, and then I'll come back. Okay, so obviously you see an extremely, extremely high correlation between Matt Smith rising every day, and then the sun rises 15 minutes after Matt Smith awakes. And you see how that changes across 4 different cities in the world. So you see that change in Tokyo, Bali, Singapore, and then Los Angeles. So you see when Matt Smith arises in Tokyo, at a very early time of the day, that the sun rises 15 minutes later. And this happens for 33 consecutive days in 4 different cities. So then Matt travels from Tokyo to Bali and he wakes up 2.5 hours later, and then the sun rises 15 minutes after he wakes up, even though it's 2.5 hours later. Then he goes to Singapore, and then he wakes up 1 hour later, and then he did in Bali, and then the sun rises 15 minutes after Matt Smith wakes up, and then he moves to Los Angeles, and he wakes up earlier again, and then the sun rises 15 minutes after Matt Smith wakes up. So it seems like you could easily explain to fool people saying that Matt Smith waking up is the event that causes the sun to rise every day, everywhere around the world. Because, look, he goes to 4 different cities and the sun rises exactly 15 minutes after he wakes up. Except a logical person would conclude that Matt Smith's biorhythms are set whereby he's going to wake up 15 minutes before sunset no matter where he lives in the world. So that is the primary factor that contributes to almost a perfect correlation of Matt Smith waking up and then the sun rising 15 minutes later, where Matt Smith is not the cause of the sun rising. So just be very careful when people use correlation to conclude causation, because I've just shown you how something can be almost perfectly correlated, but there's no causation between the two. And of course, I know some people are going to say, well, some of the videos, some of the graphs and visuals that you had used, like the extremely high correlation of U.S. dollar devaluation by the U.S. Federal Reserve and the increase in the Dow Jones Industrial Index, how you've used those correlations to conclude that the nominal gains in U.S. dollars really translates into a loss in real wealth. Well, that's because the Dow Jones Industrial Index is actually priced in U.S. dollars. Okay, so in that case, you can prove that the correlation is causation. So just be careful in being able to understand the difference between correlation and causation.
I mean, it's not just that wages are stagnating, but when you take into consideration rising costs, the rising costs of rents or homes, dramatically increasing costs of healthcare, the rising costs of childcare, and also the rising costs of higher education, rising much faster than inflation. Take all of these into consideration, and you find that it's much worse than just stagnating wages. It's basically middle-class families, often with 2 wage earners, working harder and harder and harder and getting nowhere.
Here in this clip, I thought for 1 second that Robert Reich was going to turn it around, because he said the reason the middle class is shrinking all around the world is because incomes are stagnating, but yet prices are increasing. So, but he never again, it seems like he wants to avoid ever blaming central bankers or fractional reserve banking for the growing wealth and inequality in the world, even though they are the primary causation of growing wealth and inequality. So again, he doesn't address why prices are rising. All he says is that prices are rising, incomes are stagnating, and people can't get anywhere because of this. And he fails to address the reason why prices are rising.
And this is an important point, and it's one that's very often lost. But it was the focus of my attention. You see, there's no such thing as a perfectly free market anywhere. Government sets the rules by which the market functions. All of these rules are necessary in order to construct a free market. The real question is, who do these rules benefit and who do they hurt? And in the last 30 years, as the structure of the economy began to shift, many of the rules governing our market began to shift as well. Today, we're going to try to explain the mystery of why inequality has been widening. Remember, the economy is growing all of this time. The economy continues to grow. Look, here is gross domestic product growth from 1929 to 2011. The economy overall has done extremely well, and productivity.
Now this clip is especially clever in its delivery because Robert Reich says, now this is a very important point that very few people understand. So of course, what do people watching the documentary do? They lean in because they want to know, they want to make sure they don't miss this very important point. And then he goes on to say that there are no perfectly free markets. Now, what's the insinuation and implication from that statement? That there are free markets, but they're just not perfect. And he said governments have to create laws that regulate these free markets. Now, that is an absolute lie, because it is an economic truth that central banks cannot coexist with free markets. Because a free market, the very definition, which a lot of people don't even know, who have already received their MBAs or whoever have already gotten their PhD in economics, don't understand that free markets means the market is regulating interest rates. So if you have a central bank artificially setting interest rates, as you hear, Bank of Japan decides to increase interest rates by 0.25%, or the U.S. Federal Reserve slashes interest rates by 0.5%. That is a central bank that is manipulating free markets. So it is just as much of a maxim that two objects can occupy the same space at the same time. That's basically unbreakable law of physics. It is an unbreakable law of economics that a central bank and a free market cannot coexist in the same country. So you have no free markets. Bankers, in fact, only exist to manipulate markets. They manipulate every single market, capital market in the world, whether it's real estate, whether it's stock markets, whether it's commodities like gold and silver, wheat, oil. They manipulate and rig everything, including foreign exchange rates, interest rates, and all this has been proven, by the way. It's been documented. You just have to Google and find out the 19 or so banks that were rigging interest rates, that were rigging LIBOR rates, and on and on and on and on. So I remember, so this is a very, very important point to get, so you don't fall into the disinformation that Robert Reich is trying to get people to accept in this documentary here. There are no free markets. He never wants to suggest that central banking and central bankers and fractional reserve banking could be the problem of growing wealth inequality in the world, when in my opinion is the primary problem why there is massive and increasing wealth inequality all over the world. So let me explain to you why this concept of this false concept and this lie that free markets exist instead of central bankers and commercial bankers rigging every single capital market in the world to their benefit, to the detriment of humanity, why this concept is so important for people like Reich to promote, to get everyone to accept. Because if they promote this concept, then they can go on to say what's wrong with the free market. So then, oh yes, the bankers will come to the rescue. And then during crisis, it is important for the elite to have people to turn to bankers to present the solution. So you saw this when this happened during the crisis that arose in 2008. Every single elite publication, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, you all saw them promote Ben Bernanke, who was then the Fed Reserve Chairman, as the man who saved the world. Even Time magazine, I can't remember the exact headline, but he had something like, the man, they had a headline like the man who saved the world. And even Ben Bernanke himself had the arrogance to say that we saved the world, when they are in fact the men that are creating, like I said, these price distortions and these collapses, and deliberately creating them for their own benefit, and then saying that they came to the rescue. Now, what was the rescue in America? The rescue was $800 billion bailout for the criminal bankers. And where did that bailout money come from? It came from the taxpayers. So what was their solution? Their solution was robbing all the citizens of America of wealth and transferring wealth to the richest 0.1% in the entire world. So that is why there's global wealth inequality that's so massive and is growing, because they want people to turn to them as the saviors when the free markets that don't even exist collapse, when there's a problem, when there's a crisis. So they say, oh, there wasn't enough, and even Alan Greenspan said there wasn't enough regulation of the free markets. That's why this crisis happened in 2008, and that's why we had to save the world. So it's all this rubbish that you can't fall victim to. So this false narrative that all the elite want to sell, like there are free markets that exist when they don't exist, and that bankers can be trusted to save the world when these crises that they create arise like every 5 years. I think Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan said something like, crisis is just something that arises every 5 years. Like, like it wouldn't arise without all the fraud and all the manipulation of bankers like him, which are the reason why these crises arise. And if you look to history, you can see the truth, because after World War I, when the Bank of England bankers engaged in massive QE, now QE, or quantitative easing, is just a term Ben Bernanke invented recently to try to confuse people. But all QE means devaluation and debasement of currency. So that's been going on forever, because during World War I, the British bankers basically created twice as many pounds that existed pre-World War I, but they didn't back any of the new pound creation used to finance the war with any gold. So they basically extremely devalued the British pound by over 50%. And then when that happened, they turned to the U.S. Federal Reserve to basically debase the U.S. dollar, because everyone was bringing back, because they're still the gold standard, British pounds to British bankers, and getting the British bankers receiving debased fake paper currency and having to turn over real money of gold in return. So Alan Greenspan said what the Federal Reserve did was that they saved the British bankers from losing the real money of gold by debasing the U.S. dollar, which then ushered in the U.S. stock market crash and the Great Depression. So you see all the real dots being connected instead of the fake dots that Robert Reich connects in his Inequality for All documentary. And Alan Greenspan said, we saved the British bankers from losing the real money of gold, but we almost destroyed the world's economies in the process. So every once in a while, you have one of these immoral bankers slip up and actually tell you the truth of how the systems work. And that is how basically central banking causes an increase in growing global wealth inequality. Now, they also use the same narrative, like free markets will fail and bankers have to intervene to save the global economies, to sell also other false narratives like TBTF, which is too big to fail. So this is why they said they had to steal money from American citizens and give to the criminal bankers. So banks like Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, so all these big banks wouldn't fail, right? But think about it. That's what should have happened under a free market. These big banks would have failed, and there is no such thing as too big to fail. Because if these big banks have failed, what would we have had now in 2014 when I'm making this video? We would have had 6 years of rebuilding and recovery. And we would have had some kind of stability in our economy by now. But instead, by bailing out these criminal bankers learn there's no punishment for criminality, so we're going to continue manipulating the markets like we did in the past. We're going to continue misusing our customers' deposits and taking huge risks and gambling and turning our banks into massive hedge funds, because there's no punishment for failure. And we reap 100% of the rewards that we made from taking huge risks. But if we fail, we know we'll just be bailed out again. So that is a problem. That is why we have even bigger price distortions today than existed in 2007. And everyone will see it. This is not conjecture. You're going to have massive, massive financial earthquakes in the next 2 or 3 years that are going to occur. Now I'm going to read you a very, very revealing statement from Alan Greenspan in U.S. congressional testimony in 1998. He said, quote, "You don't have a free market." Now notice the language. He doesn't say we don't have a free market. He said you, meaning you and I, don't have a free market, because again, central bankers and commercial bankers are manipulating the market to their own advantage. So it doesn't matter that a free market doesn't exist to them. It only matters to people that are trying to control in all nations that a free market doesn't exist. He goes on to say, central banks determine the money supply, not the market. We are not on a gold standard because leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries don't want a market that functions in that manner. End quote. So understand what he just said. He said, we don't have a free market, period. And he said, why? because if we have a free market, then bankers wouldn't be able to make billions of dollars or even trillions of dollars with zero labor, which they can do now because all they do is manipulate the market. So these are the key points, and this is why I have such a problem with Robert Reich's Inequality for All documentary, because he consistently tells bold-faced lies throughout the whole documentary that sounds wonderful on the surface, sound like wonderful explanations. So why are many of us so easily fooled by all this propaganda? Unfortunately, it's because today we have a language of lies. And in order to get my message across to many different kinds of people, sectors of people, I'm actually going to make like a spoken word piece called The Language of Lies and put it here, because it's just another creative way, I guess, of reaching a different segment of the population that perhaps would not watch my videos. But by language of lies, I mean, for example, when people always talk about free markets, now most people don't even know the real definition of free markets. So I suggest that if you're unsure of what free markets really are, then to look it up. Look it up and do some research. Spend like 10 minutes. Because again, the learning process always works a lot better if you're more proactive in it rather than just watching someone else tell you what things are. And as I always say in all my videos anyways, don't believe anything I say without doing your own research, because doing your own research and then confirming the things I say will lead to a better understanding of the concepts I'm speaking about in any case, in any situation. So when people say, oh, this quantitative easing stuff is great because look at it, stock markets are going back up. No, stock markets, as I showed you the other graph, they're not rising. They're rising on the back of debased currencies. So it's a gain in nominal fiat paper currencies, but a loss in real wealth that is occurring. And people must understand that. And the last point I want to make before I show you another clip from Inequality for All is this. At the end of that clip too, you see, look at GDP. GDP's doing great. So obviously, it's not the problem with the economy. The economy is doing great. That's not why there's growing global wealth inequality. Now, if you believe that, again, then I have some swampland in Florida I want to sell you. Because if you have listened to this video and you are still here at this point, which I hope you are, you realize how falsified inflation statistics are by bankers and governments, then you would realize how falsified every key economic indicator is, including gross domestic product, and that is falsified by every government and all banking cartels all over the world. So they're not accurate, and it's too much for me to go into, but I could show you that the degree of falsification of GDP in the U.S. is the same degree of falsification as even the inflation rates. So that is not true. That is patently a lie. That is a blatant falsehood that Robert Reich is promoting. And in fact, when we hear of like boom bust cycles, which you also learn in like economics 101 classes, a boom would suggest, and again, the implication that there is some kind of economic sustainability as far as why the boom is happening. But a boom is much more accurately described as price distortions, because they're being manipulated. Prices are being manipulated higher by central and commercial bankers, and they're unsustainable price distortions. So that's why you get these massive price distortions that inevitably will always collapse. And that's why you're going to get another collapse of the U.S. stock market sometimes, and that's where you're going to get collapse of these real estate markets in Southeast Asia that have been booming because they're unsustainable, because their manipulation's higher by bankers. After central bankers deliberately created the conditions that created massive price distortions, which they call the Roaring Twenties in America, that led to the U.S. stock market crash in 1929 and then the Great Depression. What happened? After the Great Depression, in 1933, the U.S. congressmen, they passed legislation called the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, what was the purpose of the Glass-Steagall Act? The purpose of the Glass-Steagall Act was not to regulate free markets, because obviously, as I already explained, you have no free markets when central banks exist. The purpose of the Glass-Steagall Act was to regulate the criminality of the central bankers, to ensure that they cannot commit massive fraud, price distortions that would lead to another Great Depression. But what happened? In 1999, because the bankers formed bank lobbying groups, which spend millions and millions of dollars every year, they lobbied the U.S. congressmen to overturn the protection that consumers were given through the Glass-Steagall Act with the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and that overturned the Glass-Steagall Act. When did that happen? 1999. So then you see again the boom in price distortions in stock markets and real estate markets and everything else that happened since then. So, okay, I'm going to show you now another clip from Inequality for All.
A guy like me is a job creator at the center of the economic universe. The current economic arrangements are righteous and justified. I know how comfortable this is to believe because I used to believe it. You know, I grew up kind of believing that. And when people challenge that idea, I would say things like, well, you just don't understand economics. But of course, if rich business guys like me are not job creators, it's actually our customers that are the job creators. We are not the center of the economic universe. They are. We need to replace trickle-down economics with middle-out economics. And indeed, every place you look on Earth where you find prosperity, you find massive investments in the middle class and the poor. Because at the end of the day, they are the true job creators. The most pro-business thing you can do is to help middle-class people thrive.
Now this clip is particularly ingenious because they found a guy that's very wealthy. He earns between 10 and 30 or 40 million dollars every single year, and they get him to admit that he's been wrong in some of his arguments when people confront him about wealth inequality. He said, oh, it's just you don't understand economics, right? Because that's the exact argument that the bankers used during the global financial crisis in 2008 when they pled to use $800 billion of taxpayer money to bail out the criminal bankers. They said, oh, it's just too complicated, you don't understand, but we have to do this. If we don't do this, then we're going to have a major crisis tomorrow, so you have to approve this bailout. By major crisis, they just meant the bankers were going to lose their money. So they didn't want that, of course, so of course they stole money from taxpayers to give to the bankers. And the rationale they used to explain that is that, oh, it's just the economics of this whole situation is too complicated for you to understand, so you just better say yes, otherwise we're going to have martial law tomorrow. So the implication in this clip is, okay, here's another guy you're saying that said the exact same rationale they used in 2008 to approve a bailout to criminal bankers, and he's saying, well, I now realize that that was wrong. So the implication is now they're going to tell you truths of how money and economics really works in this documentary. But that, as I already explained to you, they don't do any of that. So that is brilliant, and how they twist this logic by saying, okay, we're going to find another guy that he's sincere, and I believe, at least from this clip, he looks very sincere. It looks like a very compassionate guy, and we're going to find this guy to actually admit some of the things he said was wrong, to imply that things we're telling you in this video are true, when in fact they are absolutely garbage and rubbish. But there is one thing this gentleman says that I do give credit for, and that's the fact that trickle-down economics does not work. It's the voodoo economics, it does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is because I'm just going to go into this briefly, because it would take me a whole hour to explain this in detail that I would want to explain it. But the system is rigged in such a manner, the very banking platform that we use, fractional reserve banking, is rigged to give the half or the 0.1% of the 0.1 of 1% of the richest people in this world the greatest advantage in making more wealth for themselves. So in other words, the middle class and the people in poverty are constantly swimming upstream like a salmon trying to build more wealth. While for the wealthiest of the wealthiest, it is all smooth sailing on this luxurious yacht with the wind at their backs and being able to create more wealth. Now, they deliberately created a system in this manner because of the facts I told you, because of QE, the constant, the daily, weekly, monthly, annual debasement of fiat currencies that central bankers deliberately are engaging in all the time. Translates, again, it converts 50,000 2014 US dollars into the purchasing power, just $3,277.1980. That is QE for you. That is inflation. That is debasement of currency. But what happens in this monetary creation process is that, again, the wealthiest of the wealthiest get first crack of this newly created money by central bankers. So therefore, it is worth the very peak of its worth at the time they receive this money. So by the time this money trickles down to the middle class, it could have already lost 50% of its valuation through QE and inflation. And by the time the poor gets it, it could have lost 88%. So you understand what I'm saying, right? If it loses already half of its value by the time it reaches the middle class basically have to make 100% double their money just to get back to even, just to get back to the starting point of the wealthy. And with the poor, when it's already lost 80 or 90%, my God, they have to already, make up multiples of, they have to basically not just triple, but they gotta like quintuple, make 6, 7, 8 times their money just to get back to the starting point that the wealthiest people receive this money. And then the whole irony of the situation is that the wealthiest of the wealthiest get the money when the currency, I should say, because I hate even calling fiat currencies money, because it's not real money. It's money in the sense that it can be used to trade for goods and services, but it's not real money in the fact that it has sustainable purchasing power over long periods of time. So they receive this currency when it's worth the most, and then also when they can buy into real estate, stocks, commodities at the lowest point. So they are also able to drive the price distortions the highest and then exit when the price distortions are the greatest, but when the middle class and the poor are just receiving this money to get in at points when the price distortions are already great. So just to make sure everyone understands this point in crystal clear fashion, there is no level playing field. As long as central banks have been in existence, there never was a level playing field. So all these sayings like work harder to get wealthy, pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you're poor, that is not something that is really feasible, because the whole playing field is absolutely slanted towards the wealthiest of the wealthy to help them earn wealth and create more wealth for themselves in a very easy manner, where everyone else is swimming like a salmon like 3,000 miles upstream the entire way. So I would have no problem with those sayings if indeed there were a level playing field. Put the level playing field in existence, return to sound money, and then I'm all for this concept.
Somebody earning $10 million a year doesn't spend $10 million. They save it. And those savings go anywhere around the world. They can make the most money, get the highest return. They become part of the global capital market, including a lot of speculative instruments. I mean, gold and real estate and anything else that they're all chasing.
Okay, so that's the last segment I'm going to show you from the documentary Inequality for All. And the last point I just want to make is, of course, they had to get the dig in that, okay, well, wealthy people can use their money in speculative investments like gold. Now, that is a crazy statement, because the most speculative investment you could choose to try to preserve your wealth is fiat currencies, because all fiat currencies throughout history, which no one will ever know if you only received your education through institutional academia, all fiat currencies have gone to their intrinsic value of zero. That is right, zero in 27 years. So the fact that the US dollar has survived for 100 years now, but some of those buttresses to support the US dollar are now fastly crumbling. And I already talked about the geopolitics of that with the BRICS nations and so forth that is happening now. Oh, I just wanted to say one other really important thing about the gold standard, because a lot of people, I've seen increasing amount of articles saying there's no possibility we could ever return to a gold standard, here's why. And all the reasons I've ever seen is because either A, there's not enough gold in the world, they say, to support all the fiat currencies in existence, but of course that is not a real reason, because you'd be starting with a new currency. You have to get rid of, these trillions and trillions of yen and euros and dollars that the central bankers have created out of thin air, and start with another currency and back at 100% by gold. But a lot of the other reasons people say we can't return to gold standards is because it's never worked. They said it's always failed. We've had crises under gold standards before, so gold standards does not introduce price stability, does not introduce sustainable economies. And again, they were talking about the period of Bretton Woods, and I already told you Bretton Woods is not a real gold standard. So again, do your own research. Again, I don't have time to go into all that in this video because that would be another 2 hours of knowledge that I have to put forth to really explain this properly. So just do your own research before you take any of the propaganda that's being put out there. Because the propaganda, I'm telling you, as we near the end of these currency wars and as we near more dire, come upon more dire economic situations in countries all over the world, the propaganda is going to get stronger. So you need to basically get in tune with monetary and banking truths today. So as I've explained, if their bankers are lying so severely about inflation, about GDP, then you have to consider the fact that they'd be lying about having gold standards at times when there was no true gold standard as well. And finally, here's my last comment as far as why I think this documentary was made. I think it has to do a lot with psychology. Like I've talked about psychology very briefly in this video, like the language of lies. I'm going to make some videos about confirmation bias as far as like why people continue to believe lies even when they're presented with facts that contradict their preconceived notions about what is true and what is not true. And also the Milgram experiment. If you don't know what the Milgram experiment was, it was basically an experiment in which they hired actors to put on white lab coats and pretend they were doctors, and they placed the actors that were doctors, the actors are pretending to be doctors, in the same room as the test subject, and told them to dial up an instrument that would give a shock to another person in an adjacent room, but there's a wall separating, so they couldn't see the other person. And then every time they gave this person a shock, the actor in the other room would scream, but the subject believed they're giving a real shock, and they wanted to see how far they could test their limits and their boundaries of how severely they would shock the test subject. And as long as the doctor was saying, it's okay, you're not going to get in trouble, keep shocking it, they found that incredibly that a great number of subjects would subject their test subject to a great amount of pain, or at least they believe they're subjecting their test subject to a great amount of pain. Of course, the test subjects were just pretending to be shocked and would just scream when they weren't receiving no shock. So I think that the bankers have seen, and they know the history of the Milgram experiment, and they say, hey, Robert Reich, since he was former U.S. Labor Secretary, people look to him as an authority. So if we get him to say all this disinformation in this video, we can get a whole bunch of people to believe that these are the factors why people's lives all around the world are crumbling, and then when really everything hits the fan, and it will within the next couple of years, that we won't be blamed. Even though we're to blame, we can then we can blame it on immigrants, we can blame it on other people, we can blame it on other factions, we can blame it on Muslims, we can blame it on religious groups, but it will prevent people from finding out the truth about who's really to blame, which are central bankers and their immoral, illicit system of fractional reserve banking. Now please remember that there's a huge difference, as I've explained clearly in this video, between correlation and causation. So while there may be immigration problems in your nation, while there may be geopolitical tensions with other nations, that you have to understand that bankers are only using these tools to distract you away from what I've clearly shown to be the number one causation of wealth destruction and growing wealth inequality in your country, which is their fractional reserve banking policies, their policies of currency debasement, and the huge price rises caused by inflation that these central bankers and commercial bankers are deliberately creating in your country. Basically, that concludes my video about just debunking the documentary Inequality for All. So I especially would like to hear from students of Robert Reich's, whether it's your current student at the UC Berkeley or whether you took his class like 10 years ago. And if my video actually changed your opinions about wealth and poverty and the main reasons behind growing global wealth inequality all over the world. So please do comment below. I'd love to hear your comments. I'll put a lot of links below to other areas or other articles that you can read that you can formulate your own opinions about what is true, what's not, because that's the most important part of the learning process. And until next time, remain intensely curious. So long.